It's a true story, but the names have been changed to protect the innocent, as they say. Story about Greg. Greg was a computer analyst in his 40s. He'd been married 3 times already. And he'd been dating a woman named Marie, who was also divorced and had a 7-year-old child. And they'd been dating for a little more than a year, and they decided to get married. And they started their pre-marriage counseling with their pastor. They were making their wedding plans, and everything was going very smoothly for a month or 2. And then Greg began to develop a case of very cold feet. And when he shared this with Marie, she suggested that he get away for a day or 2 to clear his head, to leave all the worry and stress behind. So Greg started driving with no particular destination in mind, and he found himself at the lake. And he got out of his car and he began to walk and enjoy the calm, and it was soothing his jangled nerves. And he came to a bench that looked over the lake, and he sat down, and he took some deep breaths and attempted to unravel all the knots in his stomach. And as he looked out over the lake, it was like staring into the mirror of the soul, and things started to become clear for Greg. He saw that there were 3 main knots in his stomach, and he could put a name and a cause to each. The first knot was due to the fear that the odds were against him, and that he would keep repeating the same relationship patterns that he had before with the same dismal results. And the second knot was caused by his fear of all the stresses coming at the fragile, newly formed family from outside sources: custody stress, job stress, family pressures. And the third was the hardest, knottiest knot of them all. It was the fear that he was just not worthy of another human's love, not worthy of God's love. Now, I think Greg had the right idea, taking time to find a quiet place to sit and name the knots in his stomach, just as we too need to name our own knots, to examine our own fears, to see what they are keeping us from accomplishing. Now, our text this morning is Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33. Immediately, he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But by the time the boat, battered by the waves, was still far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, and he started walking on the water, and he came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and he caught him, saying to him, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, all across America this morning, in thousands of churches, untold numbers of people are hearing a sermon on this text. And the majority, if I had to guess, are getting a sermon about stepping out on faith. That Peter had the right idea, getting out of the boat and quite literally stepping out on faith, did he not? Hadn't many of us seen Jesus standing there on the still waters of this world, beckoning us to come to him? And like Peter, we must have answered the invitation and find the courage to climb over the side of the boat and to step out into the water. And if we do, if we can muster up the courage, if we have enough faith, then we will walk out to Jesus, trusting him to help us do great things for God. Watching out for doubts, cautious of the fears, ignoring the howling winds and the waves battering, keep your eyes on Jesus. And if you can do that, you'll find the strength and courage to stay on top of the water. Now, and thus endeth the lesson. Maybe. Many of those thousands of sermons being preached in this passage today will have as the theme the command to get out of the boat, as a well-meaning attempt to spur the listeners on and give them the courage to take risks in their personal lives or perhaps in their faith walk. Or the other popular take on the scripture, the command to keep your eyes on Jesus, and another well-intentioned and maybe even helpful invitation to greater devotion and Christian commitment. And you know what? Any of those messages are absolutely legitimate approaches that are supported by the text. After all, Peter does indeed get out of the boat only to founder when the storm rages around him and causes him to lose focus on Christ. These themes are not wrong, they just don't tell the whole story. There's a lot more meat on this bone, so let's dig in and shoot for a bit. This passage comes immediately after the feeding of the 5,000 men, that is. We must always remember the women and the children would have made that number much larger, 2 or 3 times. And then no sooner than this sort of communion is over, Jesus sends his disciples ahead in the boat while he dismissed the crowd. And he told them to go ahead, he'd catch up. Why would he do that? Because Jesus needed to pray. If you look back to just before the feeding of the 5,000, we see that Jesus had just found out that his cousin, friend, and gospel co-worker, John the Baptist, had been killed by Herod. And after hearing this sad news, Jesus wanted to be alone. So he took a boat to a lonely place where he could presumably weep and mourn and pray to his Father in private. But the crowds followed him, intruding on his heartache. And even in his grief, he had compassion for the crowd, so he healed their sick. Doesn't that tell us a great deal about the character of Jesus? About the character and behavior that we as Christians are called to emulate, to imitate, to follow? That even in the midst of his mourning, in the depths of his grief, he was moved by compassion and the needs of the crowd. He did not tell them to buzz off and leave them alone. No, he had compassion and healed their sick. But that's not all. After healing their sick, he still didn't send them on their way, even after the disciples suggested it. No, he fed this huge crowd with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and there were leftovers. Can you imagine how miraculous that must have been to the disciples and all those present? And after all that, Jesus sends the disciples on ahead so they can try once more to be alone and pray and mourn his dead cousin. Now, we don't know how much time Jesus got to himself, but that evening, one of those sudden Sea of Galilee squalls came blowing in. Now, the boat may not have been in danger of sinking like our other stormy sea story, but they were certainly getting tossed around and going nowhere against that wind. They were being buffeted by wind and water in the midst of a very dark night, and that was surely a frightening, if not dangerous, situation to be in. And in the middle of that howling storm, the disciples see someone walking toward the boat, walking on water. And they were, rightfully I think, truly terrified. They thought they were being approached by a ghost. They were scared. Wouldn't you be? I would. So Jesus comes to them, and he reassures them. Now, for the sake of good English grammar and for it to make sense in English, most translations do something similar to what our NRSV does. And they translate Jesus' words into something like, it is I, or it's me, or I am here. But you're going to get a little tiny Greek lesson this morning. The Greek says, ego eimi, I am. Now, ego eimi is kind of an awkward phrasing, even in Greek. Most Greek speakers would leave off the ego and they would just say, eimi, because the ego was implied. So that particular phrasing is intentional. Here and elsewhere in the Gospels, this simple phrase, ego eimi, powerfully connects Jesus to Yahweh. Neither disciples or Matthew's audience would mistake the pronouncement of the divine name, I am. For when Moses asked God at the burning bush for his name, what does God say? Yahweh is the great I am. And Jesus, more than once, connects himself to the Spirit, saying, God. Jesus is God, and that's why his presence gives us the courage to not be afraid. Now, in the middle of the 4th century, the mid-300s, there was a brilliant thinker of the early church. His name was Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, who clarified how we think about Jesus. Because up until then, there had been this ongoing theological argument. There were lots of those in the early church, to be honest, that were arguing about the nature of Jesus. And one camp posited that Jesus was an apparition who only seemed to be human. He was a divine apparition. And the other camp thought that Jesus was a human being who only seemed to have miraculous powers. But Athanasius put 2 and 2 together, and he concluded that Jesus Christ is both fully human and fully divine. Because if he were not fully human, he would not have the compassion to save us. And if he were not fully divine, he would not have the power to save us. So thus, fully human, fully divine. And then Peter, that impetuous, headstrong Peter, calls out, if it is you, command me to come out on the water. Anyone else notice the demanding aspect of that? He's not really asking, is he? Peter's yelling out, Lord, if it's you, then command me to come out. And Jesus responds with, come on in, the water's fine. Or something to that effect. And Peter, ever the one to run headlong into events, climbs out of the boat and starts walking towards Jesus. Now, we don't know how far he got before he started to sink. A gust of wind knocked him off balance. A larger than usual swell made for him, and suddenly the logic of the situation was just too much for Peter to discount. So he yielded to the inevitable tug of gravity. Now Jesus saves him, of course, gently scolding him for his doubt. And they climb into the boat, and the storm stops as suddenly as it had started. And the disciples who had remained in the boat all along, and doing the utterly proper act, they started worshiping Jesus as God's Son. For the first time in Matthew's Gospel, the disciples actually worship Jesus. He had healed and fed the thousands, hungry and vulnerable people, showing both divine power and divine compassion, but it's only here, in their moment of terror, that the disciples recognize most clearly who Jesus is. And isn't that the way it so often works? This passage reveals something about the disciples that is telling us something deeply true about humanity. I know, speaking for myself, I know that I have often overlooked the presence of God when my life is peaceful and pleasant, when things are going fabulously. But I find myself calling out, reaching out to Him and pleading with God to help me when things get difficult. Fear and despair do more to make me aware of God's presence than the miraculous things that happen all around every single day. Fear brings home to us just how vulnerable we are. There's something about fear, about those trials and tribulations, that it cuts through life's clutter and distractions so that we can feel God more clearly. I think the power of fear, both in this passage and in our lives, is often overlooked. Because Peter didn't founder because he takes his eyes off Jesus, but because he grows afraid. And to be honest, that fear is justified. It's a storm, for Pete's sake, raging powerfully enough to endanger the boat, let alone a single person. In other words, he has a perfectly valid reason to be afraid. And so do we, don't we? We fear the return of illness. We fear the stability of a fragile relationship. We fear loneliness after the loss of a loved one. We fear not being accepted by those we value. We fear whether we'll fare well in a new chapter of our lives. We fear for the future of our congregation. We fear for the direction of our country. You name it, there's a lot of things in our lives that can make us afraid. And that fear fear can be crippling. It'll sneak up on you. It'll paralyze you and make it difficult to move forward at all, let alone move with confidence. Fear is, in short, one of the primary things that robs the children of God of the abundant life God intends for us. And for this reason, I tend to take Jesus' words to the disciples of, "Ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" more as sadness than a rebuke. With Peter's fear, Jesus doesn't simply encourage him or instruct Peter to keep his eyes on him. No, when Peter begins to sink, Jesus reaches out and grabs him and saves him from drowning. And so it is with us. Jesus will not let us go. Jesus is with us. He will grab hold of us when we falter and restore us. And that is the promise at the heart of this story. The promise at the heart of Matthew's gospel, and indeed our entire faith. That God will never give up. That God is with us and for us. And in the end, will do what we cannot. And this promise is the one thing I know that helps us cope with fear. Because fear is, after all, a part of our lives, and we should take care that being fearful is not equated to faithlessness. Courage is not the absence of fear, but it's the ability to hold our ground and do what needs to be done even when we are afraid. And friends, we are never promised an easy road in this life. We are not assured of clear skies and smooth sailing. In fact, it's just the opposite. Jesus himself tells us that in this world we will have troubles, that we will have trials and tribulations. But in that suffering, in the midst of that uncertainty, we are bound to feel fear, to feel despair, but we can cling to the promise that we are not in it alone. That Jesus will be there to catch us if we start to sink, to save us and restore us, and help us overcome our fear, to help us find God in the midst of the storm.